My name is Stephen Joseph Augustine. I'm the Dean of Unama'ki College in Aboriginal Learning or Aboriginal Education. But I work here at Breton University with Unama'ki College, and I'm the Senior Administrator of the college, overseeing a specialized student service agency dealing with Aboriginal Indigenous students in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. The reason why I am hereditary chief is because I did not choose to be. That's number one. My father was Patrick Joseph Augustine, who was born in 1924. He joined the Army in 1938 and stayed in the Army until he was 1970. But he never fulfilled any of the functions of a hereditary chief because he chose to join the Army. His father, Basil Tom Augustine, also didn't fulfill any roles of the Grand Council because he had kind of political ideologies that were not really, at the time, cooperative or co-aligning with the rest of the Grand Council in its idea that it was part of a church, Roman Catholic Church. He had more Indigenous perspectives about what the role of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council was. So somehow he avoided the role of hereditary chief on the Grand Council. But his father, Tom Augustine, he was a hereditary chief on the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, and he is seen in various photographs of a gathering of chiefs, and he's wearing the chief's coat and sash. I don't think they had the sash in 1920s when he was photographed on Prince Edward Island with all the other Grand Chiefs, Grand Council chiefs at the time. They were hereditary chiefs in that context because of the fact that their ancestors signed treaties. Now, Tom Augustine's father was Noel Augustine, and Noel's father was Peter Joseph Augustine, who was chief from Elsipogtog, Rishabakto Reserve, from about 1888 until 1840, I'm sorry. And before that, in the 1760s, his father, Peter Joseph Augustine's father, was Michael Augustine, who was a hereditary chief. He was called Michael Alguimo, and he signed a treaty, the ratification of the Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1725. It was brought up the year after, in 1726, at Annapolis Royal, and he signed it as, I'm not sure if it's just Alguimo or Michael Alguimo. And then later on, in 1749, he was present at the signing of another treaty between the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet at the mouth of the St. John River, but he didn't affix his signature on the treaty. And that was signed with, I believe, Michael Franklin, who was Superintendent of Indian Affairs or something like that in Indian Affairs for the government of Nova Scotia, the colonial government of Nova Scotia at the time. And then in 1760, on March 10, Michael Augustine, he was baptized on August 28, 1747, by some kind of a rebel priest. I haven't been able to ascertain the name actually of which priest it was, but I think it might have been Leloutre, Abbé Leloutre, who was fighting and very much involved in the Acadian French culture in the Maritimes, fighting against the British cause. So Michael Augustine, because he was baptized on August 28th, on the feast of St. Augustine, we received that surname Augustine at that time. And so he signed a treaty on March 10, 1760 in Halifax as Michael Augustine. And since then, my family has always kind of reiterated our lineage to each generation, saying, you are a descendant from here, and so on and so forth. So that is the reason why they call me Hereditary Chief, is because somehow in our distant past, not maybe, partly because Grand Chief Membertou took his baptism in 1610 on June 24th on the feast of Saint Jean Baptiste. He took the name Henry because of the King of France, Henri IV, or Henry IV of France. And so he took the name Henry, and Membertou was his indigenous name, Maubiltou. So he took on Catholicism, and our people began to incorporate slowly over the years the Roman Catholic Church into the practice. And the Grand Council was the only organized indigenous structure that kept responding to the request by the church to always come to, and they almost kind of like represented what people have been doing with the crusades that have been going to the Holy Land, the Knights Templar that went there and accompanied the Crusaders that went to the Holy Land. They were there to protect them. And I guess in some way, some of the missionaries were somehow connected to that particular element of the church. And so they imposed those kind of ideologies on the Mi'kmaq Grand Council in itself. But I see it more from an indigenous perspective as more something circular, laid down on the ground, with all the chiefs kind of taking their spot on the ground, not so much being the apex of a hierarchical system, but more from a familial context, that those chiefs that had big families, that were favored as being the leaders, that have been raised by their elders and their grandmothers and mothers and great-grandmothers to become a leader, to be able to espouse the principles and the morals and values of our culture and our traditions as leaders, not as people running around with lots of money and how some of the chiefs are portrayed today by our people. They're not governed by money or by government of Canada. The hereditary chiefs are more from the ground up, chosen by our people, chosen by their lineage, by their hereditary status among their people and our culture. So that's basically where the hereditary system comes in. And there's a bit of a divide between some people, some members of the Grand Council see themselves not part of the church, and some do see themselves as being part of the church. And me, I stand more or less on the middle ground, having respect and dignity for both elements, the church and the traditional elements. And I think that's where all of us should be. In terms of my extended family going backwards, there was not really a very distinct laid out role played, other than the fact that they were always standing up to the ideology that this Skijinu, or this Usitkamu, was something of an entity that could not be owned by human beings, and that we belong to the land, like with the first legendary culture hero character, Glooskap, who peeled himself off from Mother Earth, but yet his feet were still attached to Mother Earth. And even if you take one foot off, the other one is attached. But the only way you can kind of disconnect is either you jump, but it's a momentarily disconnection. But spiritually, I think the connection is still ominous. But I think the idea that land could not be sold or given up or surrendered was a concept that was deeply embedded in our hereditary chiefs. And examples of this happen in lots of instances where treaty relations or treaty negotiations are happening. And there was a Penobscot chief from Maine. It wasn't Maine at the time. It was in 1676, where he went down to Boston, and a treaty was being negotiated. And then when he came back to Penobscot territory, Banuapskik, meaning the rocks that are jutting out of the land, he consulted with a missionary priest, and he said, I understood. I mean, he brought a copy of a written treaty to him, and it was a French priest, and the French kind of like, he read English. I mean, he could understand. And then he said, well, the English are saying you're giving up everything to them, and now that they have rights over everything around you. He said, that's not what we negotiated. That's not what we talked about. He said, we told them, if you are surrendering to us, put your sword in the ground first, and which they did. And then we put our tomahawks on, and we buried this. And this was, for us, the physical symbolism that's attached to it was an action-related thing that was very integral to our ideological perspectives of treaties at the time. It's by action. So by burying those things and linking our hands together as brothers, British, English brothers, and Indigenous brothers, that we welcomed each other and come together as a union, recognizing that there is a fence, a human fence, and our words of the treaties are within that fence. And the pipe ceremony that we do, the peace pipe it's always called, we blow our words to the giver of life, grandfather, son, Mother Earth, to Glooskap, the grandmothers, the young people, and our mothers, which we entrust our words in those spiritual entities, and nobody will break those. And that's why the indigenous perspectives of the treaties have never been broken by indigenous people. And in the other context, these are written documents that have been systematically broken since the time of the Greeks and the Romans, through all these conflicts in Europe, and then come over here. And it was the French and English conflicts, and then they got kind of shoved over to English and Indian and French and Indian wars, as they were termed. So this perspective of, from an indigenous perspective, the agreements were those things that were entrusted spiritually through ceremony. And so when we go back to the peace and friendship treaties, those were the things that were very integral to the English. But somehow, through diseases, mumps, measles, and scarlet fever, whatever else, the indigenous people died off quite drastically. 95% maybe of our population, and we were dwindled down to about 1,500 in the middle of 1840s, 50s, according to Silas Rand, who was the Baptist minister that translated the Bible into Mi'kmaq and tried to persuade the Mi'kmaq to follow the Baptist religion, but the Mi'kmaq were so ensconced in the Catholic Roman Catholic Church that they refused to and he only converted one person that was helping him. And on his deathbed, he converted back to Catholicism because he asked to be buried in a Catholic church. Anyway, so the chiefs that were hanging around Silas Rand at the time asked him to write a letter to Queen Victoria, and which said that they never surrendered the land to the English, that the question of land was an issue for them, and that they were being slowly squeezed out of territories where they used to go to hunt and fish and trap and so on and so forth. So they were lodging a complaint to Queen Victoria in 1847, 1851, that Silas Rand translated the letter for them from Mi'kmaq to English, and he submitted the letter to the Lieutenant Governor in Nova Scotia, and it was delivered to the Queen Victoria. So the idea of this not surrendering the land was an idea that was somehow entered into the ideology when France surrendered to King of England. So with in 1763, the Treaty of Paris was entered into in Paris for the protection of French rights in Quebec, especially. They wanted their language, they wanted their laws, the Napoleonic Code for laws, and their religion, the Catholic religion. So that was guaranteed for the French in the treaty, in the Royal Proclamation. And also the indigenous, there were no representatives of the indigenous people other than the governors and lieutenant governors of the British colonies that said, wait a minute, we entered into these treaties with these indigenous people, so there are territories that we haven't really acquired from them. So they said, well, under the Royal Proclamation, those territories should be protected. And the only way that indigenous people can surrender their rights to those lands is to surrender them to the British Crown, and that the Crown can turn around and grant those lands or sell them to British subjects or whoever they want. And so this was, the Royal Proclamation was something that guaranteed the territories, the indigenous territories in North America. At the time, there was no division between US and Canada. It was North America. It was either British North America or French North America or Spanish North America or Dutch North America. So they were these kind of replications of European nations and kingdoms that came here in North America and colonized those areas. So it was a combination, I guess, of the influences of the hereditary chiefs in their trying to latch on to the ideology. We are part of the land. We are connected to the land. You can't separate us from the land. And so this ideology sustained them, their connection to the land and so on. And but over time, I mean, with the creation of Canada, Department of Indian Affairs and so on, these laws kind of wrenched us from the territories that we traditionally occupied. And now today we're trying to negotiate those things in a more dignified way, in a more rational and legalistic, judicial justice way. And so the things that I learned from my ancestors, my grandparents and my great-grandparents, like mostly, you have a responsibility to your people, look after them. There is a Grand Chief. If the Grand Chief dies, take care of that role for him, if he's not even there, that you assume that responsibility, keep taking care of your people and make sure they have food, they have clothing, they have shelter, they have tools to survive, and they have the means to travel around. And those are the things that we get from our Mother Earth, from the plants, birds, fish, and animals that we rely on for our survival. So the role of a chief, or a hereditary chief, was to ensure that our people receive those things. So my role, my responsibilities is to look after the Aboriginal title, Aboriginal rights. I mean, those two terminologies are English in its context, and basically the Aboriginal humanities and well-being of our culture and traditions that's the role that I, as a hereditary chief, a member of the Mi'kmaq Grand Council, is responsible for, not the daily activities of the economy in the way it is seen today, that we're not taking over those responsibilities of doling out money to our people in that context, but that they have access to those resources that contribute to their survival. That's the indigenous perspectives of it. And I think my ancestors taught me that the principles and the morals and the values, the fate and faith of all of these things are embedded in me, or entrusted upon me, to ensure that I fulfill those responsibilities for my people. And that's the way I see my role as a hereditary chief on the Mi'kmaq Grand Council and a captain on the Grand Council. The term captain is borrowed from the French. But the term Gebmidelamutjinam means is that person who is thought to have been very sacred and have lots of dignity, wisdom, and knowledge. Like the term Sa'amau, we turn it around backwards in Mi'kmaq language and we say Mau Sa, meaning the most oldest. And we used to look at the pine tree, guo, and istuguo waj, meaning that old, twisted, gnarled, old pine tree is a symbolic representation of our people, our leaders, who are old and wise, gnarled and twisted and wrinkled, like that old pine tree. And I firmly believe the area where we call Listuguj or Istuguaj is one of the principal areas where our people kind of found their source or their livelihood. And even Rishabakto, Elsibukto, where the fire, the path of the Great Spirit fire, and those two locations together with Unama'ki, the head of the land, and somehow, somewhere in between, Kobokwet, Begobet, the old leaders used to call it Begobek, and it's an area that kind of struck out, and they must go back to the glacial period or some heavy snow period where this area kind of stuck out, and the Debert site is in that location of that Pekopit, or in that region, and it's dated 11,500 years before present. And so I think there is a very strong oral tradition that needs to be explored more. I'm with my knowledge, I'm only touching the tip of the iceberg, the Begobek, of my culture and traditions, and I think it spans a long ways, and I think our people, the Mi'kmaq people, should and could learn a lot from our own oral history and oral traditions. I think in a lot of ways, I don't really look forward to seeing any special status other than respect, and dignity, I guess. And being acknowledged for who I am and what I do, but not an elevated kind of thing. We have to wear these sashes that identify us during our mission, St. Anne mission and Chapel Island or Bodlodek. that kind of more or less make us stand out, I guess, separate from the ordinary kaggle of men. And I say that because there are only men on the Mi'kmaq Grand Council. I mean, ideologies are changing and shifting, and we have lots of women elected chiefs now. So the ideologies are shifting in a sense that there seems to be more openness to the role of women in our culture and our traditions. But in 1987, I came to Chapel Island, and I went to I observed. I didn't take on the role as hereditary chief captain on the Grand Council. My sash was ready. I didn't take it. In fact, it wasn't my sash. It was another captain's sash who offered it to me to wear if I would to accept. Mm-hmm. And I was already kind of welcomed into the Grand Council. I was hanging out with Alec Denny, the Grand Captain at the time, and his family on the island. I mean, I stayed with them, and finally in 1989, I was formally welcomed into the Grand Council, and it wasn't until a year after that I took my sash, and Grand Chief Donald Marshall Sr. put the sash on me, and Alec Denny kind of put the pin on to put it on. It was a collaborative effort, and they brought me into the Grand Council. And basically, our role was to protect the Indigenous Aboriginal rights of Indigenous peoples. And the treaties, all they did was to acknowledge those rights that were pre-existing before the treaties were signed. And the treaties, all they meant was, yeah, okay, you can continue to live what you do. But, I mean, things that we already were doing. And today, there's a misconception that treaty rights were something that were given to us by the British Crown, but that's not the case. We had those rights already, and the treaties only protected those rights, pre-existing rights. And now the Constitution, Canadian Constitution, protects those under Section 35.